$5,000. That was the price Hanoi put on a single Australian head. In 1967, when a North Vietnamese soldier earned $3 a month, the Communist High Command offered 140 years of wages for just one scalp. Not American, not South Vietnamese, Australian. And here's what nobody wants to talk about. The bounty was never collected, not once. Not a single Australian SAS operator was ever delivered to Hanoi for payment. Why? What made these men so terrifying that an entire army couldn't catch them? What did they do in that jungle that kept generals awake in Hanoi? And why did the Pentagon classify their methods for decades longer than any other Allied unit? The Americans had Green Berets, they had Navy SEALs, they had MAC-VSOG running the most dangerous missions of the war. But the Viet Cong gave them a nickname reserved for no one else. Rung. Phantoms of the jungle. And that name wasn't respect. It was pure terror. Today, I'm going to show you what really happened in Phuoc Tuy province. The methods that American commanders studied but refused to adopt. The rivalry that's been erased from official histories. The psychological warfare techniques that made hardened enemy soldiers desert their posts rather than face these ghosts one more time. Some of what you're about to hear has never been told on this channel before. Some of it was classified for 40 years. And some of it will make you question everything you thought you knew about who really won the Shadow War in Vietnam. Stay with me until the end, because the truth about the Phantoms is darker, stranger, and more incredible than any Hollywood movie ever dared to show. Let's begin. The jungle fell silent in a way that made hardened North Vietnamese soldiers grip their rifles tighter and scan the tree line with wide, terrified eyes. It was 1967, deep in Phuoc Tuy province, and a company of battle-tested NVA regulars had just discovered something that would haunt their nightmares for decades. 3 of their comrades lay arranged in a perfect triangle, boots removed and placed beside their bodies, weapons gone, throats opened with surgical precision. Not a single shot had been fired. Not a single branch had been disturbed. The Phantoms had come and gone like smoke through bamboo, leaving behind only a message written in blood and terror. This was the calling card of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, and within months, Hanoi's High Command would take the unprecedented step of placing a $5,000 bounty on the head of any Australian SAS operator. To put that figure in perspective, the average North Vietnamese soldier earned approximately $3 per month. This bounty represented nearly 140 years of wages for a single scalp. The communist leadership had faced American Green Berets, Navy SEALs, and the legendary MAC-VSOG reconnaissance teams. They respected these units. They feared them appropriately. But the Australians? The Australians were something else entirely. Something that defied their understanding of Western warfare. Something that kept generals awake in Hanoi wondering if the ghosts of the jungle itself had turned against their cause. But this was only the first whisper of a terror that would soon consume entire provinces. What made these men from the other side of the world so terrifyingly effective that an impoverished nation would offer a king's ransom for their elimination? The answer lies buried in classified reports, suppressed Pentagon analyses, and the reluctant testimonies of American special operators who witnessed things in the Vietnamese bush that their own military refused to officially acknowledge. The story of why Ho Chi Minh's forces came to dread these phantom warriors begins not in the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia, but in the sun-scorched outback of Australia, where a different kind of soldier was being forged in methods that would make American drill sergeants weep with frustration and fascination in equal measure. The year was 1957, when the Australian government made a decision that would alter the landscape of special operations warfare forever. They established the Special Air Service Regiment, modeled loosely on the British SAS that had terrorized Nazi forces across North Africa and Europe. But the Australians did something their British cousins never quite managed. They adapted. They evolved. They created something entirely new by reaching back into the oldest military traditions on the continent. Traditions that predated European settlement by tens of thousands of years. The first recruitment notices went out to stations across the outback, seeking men who could survive in environments that would eliminate most soldiers within days. They wanted jackaroos and boundary riders, men who had spent their lives reading the land the way city dwellers read newspapers. They wanted hunters who tracked wild boar through scrubland so dense that sunlight never touched the forest floor. They wanted men who understood that the bush was not an obstacle to be conquered, but an ally to be embraced. And what they did next would shock American military planners to their core. They brought in Aboriginal trackers as instructors. These were men whose ancestors had perfected the art of silent movement and patient hunting over 40,000 years. They taught young SAS recruits to move through vegetation without disturbing a single leaf. They taught them to read footprints the way scholars read ancient texts, extracting information about speed, weight, intent, and emotional state from the slightest impression in soft earth. They taught them that hunting humans was no different from hunting any other prey, that the same patience, the same attention to detail, the same willingness to become one with the environment would produce results that brute force never could. This was heresy to the American military establishment of the 1960s. The United States Armed Forces believed in overwhelming firepower, in helicopter mobility, in body counts achieved through superior technology. The Australians believed in something far older and far more dangerous. They believed in becoming predators. But the true test of these methods would come in a jungle halfway around the world, where the phantoms would write their legend in enemy blood. The first Australian SAS operators arrived in Vietnam in 1962, a full 3 years before the major American troop deployments that would turn the conflict into a household word across the Western world. These initial teams were small, secretive, and operating under restrictions that officially did not exist. Their mission was simple in description and almost impossible in execution. Gather intelligence on Viet Cong movements in areas where American and South Vietnamese forces feared to tread. What happened over the next few months would set the template for a decade of operations that would eventually produce the most lopsided kill ratio of any unit in the entire Vietnam conflict. The Australians did not engage in the search and destroy missions that characterized American operations. They did not call in airstrikes at the first sign of enemy contact. They did not measure success in bodies counted and villages pacified. Instead, they did something that American commanders found almost unbelievable. They disappeared into the jungle for periods that defied comprehension. 10 days, 14 days, sometimes longer. They moved in 4-man patrols, traveling distances of less than 1 kilometer per day, stopping every few minutes to listen, to smell, to feel the jungle around them. They ate cold rations because cooking fires produced smoke that could be detected from miles away. They did not speak, communicating instead through hand signals developed over years of training. They defecated into plastic bags and carried their waste with them because even human excrement could alert a skilled tracker to their presence. American liaison officers who accompanied these patrols often requested extraction within the first 48 hours. The silence, the stillness, the constant hypervigilance pushed them to psychological breaking points that no amount of SEAL training had prepared them for. One Green Beret sergeant, whose name remains classified to this day, later wrote in a debriefing report that he had completed 3 tours with Maka Visog, had been wounded twice, had received a Silver Star for actions that he still could not discuss publicly. But nothing in his career had prepared him for the experience of watching Australian operators hunt human beings with the patience and precision of apex predators stalking wounded prey. The Viet Cong began to notice. They called the Australians Ma Rung, which translates roughly to phantoms of the jungle. The name was not given in respect. It was given in terror. And the terror was only beginning to spread. By 1966, the Australian SAS had established its main operating base at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy province. The area had been considered a Viet Cong stronghold, so thoroughly infiltrated by communist forces that previous South Vietnamese and American units had essentially written it off as ungovernable. The Australians were given the province as their area of operations, partly as a test, and partly because no one expected them to accomplish much with their tiny force of fewer than 200 operators. What followed over the next 4 years defied every metric that Pentagon analysts used to measure military effectiveness. The Australian SAS conducted 1,272 patrols into enemy territory. They sustained a total of 4 operators eliminated in action. They accounted for over 500 confirmed enemy casualties, with estimates suggesting the actual number may have been 3 to 4 times higher due to the nature of their operations and the difficulty of confirming eliminations in dense jungle. But these numbers only tell half the story. The kill ratio of Australian SAS patrols exceeded 50-1. Some analysts placed it closer to 100-1 when probable eliminations were included. By comparison, the average American infantry unit in Vietnam operated at a ratio of approximately 10-1, and elite units like the Green Berets rarely exceeded 20-1 in sustained operations. How was this possible? The answer lies in methodology that the Pentagon studied extensively but never fully adopted. Methods that blurred the lines between conventional warfare and something far more primal. What the Australians did next would remain classified for decades. The first element of Australian SAS superiority was their approach to intelligence gathering. While American units relied heavily on signals intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, and interrogation of prisoners, the Australians developed what they called stay-behind operations. They would insert a 4-man patrol into an area suspected of Viet Cong activity and simply wait. Not for hours, not for days, for weeks. These operators would dig shallow hides in the jungle floor, covering themselves with vegetation until they became indistinguishable from the forest itself. They would observe enemy movements, count heads, note patrol patterns, identify supply routes, and mark locations of camps and caches. They gathered intelligence so detailed and so accurate that American commanders began requesting Australian reconnaissance data over their own sources. One declassified report from 1968 describes an Australian patrol that remained stationary for 11 consecutive days, observing a Viet Cong logistics hub that American forces had been unable to locate despite months of searching. The patrol recorded the movement of over 300 enemy personnel, identified 12 separate supply routes, and pinpointed the locations of 3 underground hospitals. When they finally exfiltrated, they carried intelligence that would fuel American bombing campaigns for the next 6 months. But gathering intelligence was only part of the equation. What the Australians did with that intelligence transformed them from observers into something far more dangerous. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. The ambush doctrine developed by Australian SAS operators differed fundamentally from American approaches. U.S. forces typically established ambush positions along known enemy routes and waited for targets to enter the kill zone. When contact was made, they unleashed overwhelming firepower, often supported by artillery and airstrikes. The goal was maximum destruction in minimum time. The Australians rejected this philosophy entirely. They viewed the American approach as wasteful, noisy, and ultimately counterproductive. Massive firepower created survivors who could report the ambush location. It generated noise that could be heard for miles. It produced evidence of presence that enemy trackers could analyze and use to predict future ambush sites. Instead, Australian SAS patrols developed what they called surgical ambush techniques. They would identify a target, often a single enemy officer or courier, and eliminate them with absolute precision. 1 shot, occasionally 2. Never more. The patrol would then move silently to the body, remove any intelligence materials, and disappear before the victim's companions even realized what had happened. The psychological effect of these operations cannot be overstated. Viet Cong units began reporting that soldiers were simply vanishing from patrols. One moment a man would be walking behind his comrades. The next moment he would be gone, with no sound, no shot heard, no evidence of what had occurred. Bodies would sometimes be found hours or days later, stripped of weapons and documents, arranged in patterns that suggested something other than simple military engagement. This is where the story enters territory that official military histories prefer to avoid, territory that explains why certain Australian SAS operational reports remained classified for decades longer than comparable American documents. What comes next is not for the faint of heart. The Australians developed a psychological warfare component to their operations that borrowed heavily from Aboriginal hunting traditions and produced effects that bordered on the supernatural in the minds of their enemies. They understood that the Viet Cong were not simply enemy soldiers, but human beings with cultural beliefs, fears, and superstitions that could be exploited. Vietnamese culture placed enormous importance on the proper treatment of the departed. Bodies were to be buried with respect, with shoes in place, facing certain directions depending on local traditions. Desecration of remains was considered not merely disrespectful, but spiritually catastrophic. capable of condemning a soul to eternal wandering and bringing misfortune upon the families of the departed. Australian SAS operators began incorporating these cultural vulnerabilities into their operations in ways that official records describe in clinical language, but that witnesses remember in terms of horror and fascination. The practice that became most infamous and most effective involved the removal of boots from eliminated enemies. A patrol would conduct an ambush, eliminate their targets with characteristic precision, and then spend precious minutes removing the boots from each body before withdrawing. The boots would either be destroyed, hidden in locations where they would never be found, or occasionally left arranged in patterns that suggested ritualistic intent. The bodies would remain otherwise undisturbed, weapons in place, personal effects untouched. Only the boots would be missing. The effect on Viet Cong morale was devastating and immediate. Word spread through communist units that the phantoms were not merely eliminating their enemies, but condemning their souls to eternal suffering. Soldiers began refusing assignments in areas known for Australian activity. Desertion rates in Phuoc Tuy province climbed steadily throughout 1967 and 68. Intelligence intercepts revealed that communist political officers were spending increasing amounts of time combating supernatural fears rather than ideological doubts. But the boot removal was merely the most documented of Australian psychological operations. Other practices remained off the record entirely, known only through the reluctant testimonies of participants and witnesses who spoke only decades later, and often only under conditions of anonymity. And those testimonies would reveal methods that made even hardened veterans fall silent. The question of war crimes haunted Australian SAS operations throughout the Vietnam conflict, and continues to generate controversy to the present day. What cannot be disputed is that Australian methods achieved results that conventional approaches never matched, and that those methods existed in ethical gray zones that military lawyers preferred not to examine too closely. One American officer, embedded with Australian forces as a liaison in 1968, later described in a private memoir his first patrol with an SAS team. He had completed ranger training, served with MACVSOG, and considered himself hardened to the realities of unconventional warfare. Nothing had prepared him for what he witnessed in the jungle outside Nui Dat. The patrol had located a small Viet Cong supply party, 4 men carrying rice and ammunition through dense vegetation. The Australian patrol leader made a hand signal that the American did not recognize. What followed took less than 30 seconds. 3 of the enemy were eliminated silently, their throats opened with combat knives before they could raise an alarm. The 4th was taken alive, not for interrogation in any conventional sense, but for what the Australians called _4. The American officer declined to describe what happened to the 4th man in any detail. He noted only that the man was released several hours later, physically unharmed but psychologically destroyed, and that the information he carried back to his unit caused the immediate withdrawal of all Viet Cong forces from that sector for the next 3 months. The Australian patrol leader later explained, in terms that the American found simultaneously disturbing and compelling, that 1 terrified survivor was worth more than 100 confirmed eliminations. Fear, properly cultivated, was a weapon that required no resupply and never ran out of ammunition. Pentagon analysts who reviewed Australian methods faced an impossible dilemma. The techniques worked. They worked better than anything American forces had developed. But they could never be officially endorsed, taught, or acknowledged. And this created a rivalry that would simmer beneath the surface for years. The rivalry between American and Australian Special Operations Forces during Vietnam has been largely erased from official histories, but it burned intensely throughout the conflict. American operators arrived in Vietnam confident in their superiority. They had better equipment, better funding, better technology, and training regimens that were considered the finest in the world. They expected to teach their Commonwealth allies a few things about modern warfare. What they discovered instead was a fundamental philosophical gap that no amount of equipment could bridge. The Americans believed in domination of the battle space through overwhelming force. The Australians believed in becoming invisible within the battle space and striking with precision that made force irrelevant. Joint operations between U.S. and Australian Special Forces units were rare and often contentious. American commanders complained that Australian patrols moved too slowly, engaged too infrequently, and refused to call for fire support even when outnumbered. Australian commanders responded that American patrols were loud, impatient, and tactically predictable. One infamous exchange, documented in a declassified cable from 1967, would become legend among special operators on both sides of the Pacific. An Australian major informed his American counterpart that _5__. The American response to this assessment is not recorded in official files. But something remarkable happened when American operators spent extended time with Australian units. They changed. Green Berets and SEALs, who had initially dismissed Australian methods as primitive and slow, began adopting elements of their techniques. They learned to move more quietly. They learned to wait more patiently. They learned that the jungle could be an ally rather than an obstacle. These converted Americans became something of a problem for their own command structure. They returned from Australian liaison assignments with uncomfortable questions about U.S. doctrine and unsanctioned modifications to their operational procedures. Several were quietly transferred to less sensitive assignments. Others left the military entirely, unable to reconcile what they had learned with the institutional limitations of American special operations. And this was only the beginning of the rift that would divide two allied nations. The Nui base itself became a subject of fascination for military analysts studying the Australian approach. While American firebase construction focused on defensive perimeters, artillery positions, and helicopter landing zones, the Australians constructed something that resembled a hunting camp more than a military installation. Training areas surrounded the base where operators practiced their craft continuously. Shooting ranges emphasized precision over volume, with operators expected to achieve elimination with single shots at ranges that American marksmanship standards considered unrealistic. Movement courses wound through dense vegetation, with instructors timing how long it took a patrol to cover specific distances while remaining undetectable. Tracking exercises used both Aboriginal instructors and captured Viet Cong equipment to simulate enemy reconnaissance. The food was different. The equipment was different. Even the military culture was different in ways that visiting Americans found either refreshing or disturbing, depending on their perspective. Australian operators addressed each other by first names regardless of rank when in the field. They drank beer together in the evenings, officers and enlisted men sharing tables without the rigid hierarchies that characterized American military culture. They argued openly about tactics and listened to the opinions of junior operators who had developed innovative techniques in the field. This egalitarian approach produced an adaptability that more rigid military structures could not match. When a corporal developed a new method for silent river crossing, it could be adopted regiment-wide within weeks. When an Aboriginal tracker suggested a modification to pursuit procedures, his suggestion carried the same weight as a recommendation from a senior officer. The Australian SAS became an evolving organism, constantly refining its methods based on direct field experience, rather than doctrine developed in distant headquarters. American liaison officers sent detailed reports back to the Pentagon describing these cultural differences and their effects on operational effectiveness. Most of these recommendations were filed and forgotten, but the consequences of ignoring these lessons would prove catastrophic. The bounty on Australian SAS heads was announced through intelligence channels in mid-1967. The sum of $5,000 represented not merely a financial incentive, but a formal acknowledgement from Hanoi that these operators had become a strategic problem requiring strategic solutions. Viet Cong and NVA units received specific instructions regarding Australian forces. They were to avoid engagement if possible, reporting positions to higher headquarters for response by larger, better-equipped units. If engagement was unavoidable, they were to concentrate maximum firepower and accept heavy casualties if necessary to eliminate even a single Australian operator. The capture of an Australian SAS soldier alive was given highest priority, with significant rewards promised for anyone who could deliver such a prize for interrogation. These instructions reveal something profound about the psychological impact of Australian operations. The Communist forces had faced American special operations units for years. They had developed effective countermeasures, learned to predict patrol patterns, and accepted that elite enemy forces were simply part of the battlefield equation. They never issued similar instructions regarding American Green Berets or Navy SEALs. The Australians were different. They were unpredictable. They could not be found unless they wished to be found. They struck without warning and vanished without trace. They left behind terror that spread through enemy units like infection, destroying morale and combat effectiveness far beyond the immediate casualties they inflicted. In the calculus of guerrilla warfare, where psychological factors often outweighed physical capabilities, the Australian SAS had become the most dangerous unit in the entire conflict. But the bounty hunters would soon discover why no one ever collected that prize. The methods that made Australian SAS operators so effective were rooted in a philosophical approach to warfare that differed fundamentally from Western military tradition. Understanding this philosophy requires examining the influence of Aboriginal tracking and hunting techniques on SAS doctrine. Traditional Aboriginal hunting was not about speed or strength. It was about patience, observation, and understanding. A skilled tracker could follow prey for days, noting subtle signs invisible to untrained observers. Bent grass that would spring back within hours, faint impressions in soil that rain would erase, behavioral patterns that predicted where an animal would go, rather than where it had been. The goal was not to chase prey, but to anticipate it, to arrive at the destination before the target and wait. Australian SAS adapted these principles to human hunting with devastating effectiveness. They studied Viet Cong behavior patterns with the same intensity that their Aboriginal instructors had studied animal behavior. They learned that enemy patrols preferred to travel at certain times of day, that they avoided specific types of terrain, that they established camps near particular features that provided both concealment and water access. Armed with this understanding, Australian patrols could position themselves hours or days ahead of enemy movement, selecting ambush sites based not on where the enemy was, but on where the enemy would inevitably be. This predictive approach eliminated the need for extensive patrolling that risked detection. The Australians simply waited, invisible and patient, until their prey arrived. One former SAS operator, speaking decades after the conflict's end, described the experience in terms that mixed pride with something approaching discomfort. He explained that after sufficient time in the jungle, hunting humans became no different from hunting any other animal. The target had predictable behaviors, identifiable weaknesses, and exploitable patterns. The hunter's job was simply to read those patterns and position himself for the elimination. The moral complexity of treating human beings as prey was something he had processed only years later, during long nights when sleep refused to come and jungle shadows still flickered at the edges of his vision. But the most disturbing incident was yet to come. The relationship between Australian SAS operators and their American counterparts produced moments of cooperation, competition, and occasional conflict that official histories have largely omitted. One such incident, reconstructed from multiple sources including declassified cables and private interviews, illustrates the tension between the two forces' approaches. In late 1967, an Australian SAS patrol operating near the Cambodian border encountered a MACV SOG reconnaissance team that had inserted into the same area without coordination. The American team, consisting of 2 Green Berets and 4 indigenous Montagnard fighters, had established an observation post overlooking a suspected NVA supply route. The Australian patrol leader recognized the American position from nearly 300 meters away, identifying human presence through details so subtle that the Green Beret team leader later admitted he could not understand how detection had been possible. Rather than announce their presence through radio contact, which might have been intercepted, the Australians simply waited. For the next 6 hours, they observed the American team observing the trail. They noted that the Americans shifted position frequently, creating noise that would have alerted any experienced enemy tracker. They noted that the Americans had selected an observation post with excellent sightlines but poor escape routes. They noted that the Americans were being stalked by a Viet Cong patrol that they had somehow failed to detect. What happened next would change one American soldier's life forever. The Australian response to this situation revealed the philosophical gap between the two forces. Rather than warn the Americans through radio contact or visual signals that might alert the approaching enemy, the Australians eliminated the threat directly. In a series of engagements lasting less than 2 minutes, they neutralized the Viet Cong patrol before the Americans even knew they were in danger. The aftermath of this incident produced recriminations that echoed through special operations commands on both sides of the Pacific. American commanders complained that the Australians had violated protocols by engaging without coordination. Australian commanders responded that radio contact would have compromised both teams, and that the American observation procedures had been so poor that intervention was necessary to prevent casualties. The Green Beret team leader, confronted with the evidence that his position had been identified from 300 meters by friendly forces using nothing but observation, requested immediate transfer to Australian liaison duties. His request was denied. He completed his tour and returned to the United States, where he became one of the most vocal advocates for adopting Australian methods into American Special Operations training. His recommendations were noted, studied, and largely ignored, and the cost of that ignorance would be measured in blood. The question of what happened to enemies who encountered Australian SAS patrols and survived remains one of the most controversial aspects of the unit's Vietnam history. Official records describe standard treatment of prisoners according to international conventions. Unofficial accounts, gathered over decades from participants and witnesses, paint a considerably more complex picture. The Australians developed an approach to prisoner handling that prioritized psychological effect over intelligence gathering in the conventional sense. They understood that a traumatized survivor returning to his unit would accomplish more than any amount of extracted information. Fear was a weapon that could be manufactured and deployed, and the Australians proved remarkably adept at its manufacture. Specific techniques remain classified or disputed, but patterns emerge from multiple independent sources. Captured enemies were sometimes released deliberately, having witnessed things that they would carry back to their comrades. These message carriers, as some Australian operators called them, became unwitting agents of psychological warfare, their terror spreading through enemy units like contagion. The effects were measurable. Intelligence analysts tracking Viet Cong communications noted increasing references to the Phantoms throughout 1967 and 68. Political commissars devoted more and more time to combating fear-based desertion. Entire units refused deployments to areas known for Australian operations, creating gaps in communist coverage that could be exploited. Whether these methods constituted war crimes under international law was a question that military lawyers preferred not to answer directly. The Geneva Conventions prohibited certain treatments of prisoners, but the precise boundaries of those prohibitions remained subject to interpretation. What was clear was that Australian methods achieved results that conventional approaches could not match, and that those results saved Allied lives that might otherwise have been lost. The moral calculus of unconventional warfare rarely produces clean answers. But the transformation of Phuoc Tuy province was about to prove just how effective these methods truly were. By 1970, the Australian SAS had fundamentally transformed the security situation in Phuoc Tuy province. Areas that had been Viet Cong strongholds became safe enough for civilian economic activity. Villages that had provided support to communist forces, either voluntarily or under coercion, gradually shifted their allegiances as the balance of fear tilted toward the Australians. This transformation occurred with a force of fewer than 200 operators at any given time, supported by conventional Australian infantry and artillery, but conducting their specialized operations largely independently. The cost-effectiveness of Australian SAS operations surpassed any comparable unit in the entire Vietnam conflict. Pentagon analysts produced study after study examining Australian methods and recommending their adoption by American Special Operations Forces. These recommendations faced institutional resistance that proved insurmountable. American military culture emphasized firepower, technology, and measurable metrics. Australian methods emphasized patience, fieldcraft, and psychological effects that could not be easily quantified. The tragedy of this institutional blindness became apparent in the years following the American withdrawal from Vietnam. The lessons that Australian SAS operators had written in blood and terror across Phuoc Tuy province were largely lost. American Special Operations Forces continued developing along their established trajectory, adding technology and firepower while neglecting the fundamental skills of silent movement, patient observation, and psychological warfare. that had made the Australians so devastatingly effective. Some of those lessons would be relearned decades later, in different jungles and different deserts, at costs that proper attention to Australian methods might have avoided. But institutional memory in military organizations is short, and the rivalry that had prevented knowledge transfer during Vietnam continued to impede learning long after the conflict ended. And for the operators themselves, the war never truly ended. The aftermath of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam produced consequences that extended far beyond the immediate conflict. Operators who returned to civilian life carried with them skills, habits, and psychological burdens that did not translate easily to peacetime existence. Some found careers in security, law enforcement, or private military contracting, applying their expertise in environments that valued their capabilities. Others struggled with the transition, finding that the patience required for civilian employment bore no resemblance to the patience required for hunting humans through jungle terrain. The particular psychological adaptations that made them effective operators sometimes made them difficult citizens. The Australian government acknowledged these challenges belatedly, establishing support programs decades after the conflict ended. Veterans who had been trained to become invisible found that their experiences remained equally invisible in public discourse, overshadowed by the larger American narrative that dominated Vietnam War historiography. But among those who knew, who had served alongside Australian SAS operators, or studied their methods in classified briefings, the reputation persisted. These were the men who had terrified an enemy that faced American firepower without flinching. These were the phantoms of the jungle, the Ma Rung, the warriors whom Ho Chi Minh himself had allegedly identified as the single greatest threat to his forces in the southern provinces. The $5,000 bounty was never collected. Not a single Australian SAS head was ever delivered to Hanoi for payment. The phantoms remained phantoms, untouchable and lethal, until the day Australia withdrew its forces and the jungle fell silent once more. But their legacy was only beginning to take shape. The legacy of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam continues to influence special operations doctrine worldwide, though that influence often goes unacknowledged. The techniques developed in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy province reappear in training manuals across multiple nations, sometimes attributed and sometimes silently borrowed. The emphasis on small unit operations, patient reconnaissance, and psychological warfare that characterized Australian methods has gradually gained acceptance even within the American special operations community that initially resisted them. Modern special forces training incorporates elements of stalking and observation that would have been familiar to Aboriginal trackers, teaching young SAS recruits in the 1960s. But the full story of what the Australians accomplished and how they accomplished it remains partially hidden. Official records were sanitized. Operational reports were classified at levels that ensured decades of secrecy. Participants maintained the silence that their training had instilled, speaking only reluctantly and often only after sufficient time had passed to blur the sharpest edges of memory. What remains incontestable is the statistical record, the kill ratios, the patrol survival rates, the transformation of enemy-held territory into pacified zones, the terror that spread through communist ranks whenever the phantoms were mentioned. These numbers speak for themselves, even when the methods that produce them remain subjects of controversy and concealment. And the comparison between forces reveals an uncomfortable truth that the Pentagon never wanted to acknowledge. The American military establishment's failure to fully absorb Australian lessons represents one of the great missed opportunities of the Vietnam era. The institutional resistance to learning from a smaller, less technologically sophisticated ally cost lives that might have been saved and prolonged a conflict that might have been shortened. This resistance stemmed from multiple sources. Pride played a role. The assumption that the world's most powerful military had nothing to learn from a force of a few hundred operators from the far side of the Pacific. Bureaucratic inertia contributed. The difficulty of changing established doctrine and training programs based on field reports from a single province. Ethical concerns provided convenient justification. The argument that Australian methods could not be officially endorsed regardless of their effectiveness. But beneath these official explanations lay a deeper discomfort. The Australians had demonstrated something that American military culture preferred not to acknowledge: They had shown that superior firepower and technology did not automatically translate into superior results. They had proven that small numbers of highly skilled operators, employing methods adapted from the oldest hunting traditions on Earth, could achieve outcomes that massive military machines could not match. This was a lesson that challenged fundamental assumptions about American military superiority. It was easier to classify the reports, transfer the inconvenient liaison officers, and continue on the established path than to confront the implications of what the Phantoms had accomplished. But history would prove that ignored lessons have a way of demanding to be learned again. The individual operators who created the Australian SAS reputation in Vietnam have largely faded from public attention. They returned to farms and factories, to families and civilian careers, carrying their experiences in silence as their training had taught them. Occasionally, one would speak to researchers or journalists, providing fragments of a story that could never be fully told. These fragments reveal men who had been transformed by their experiences in ways that left permanent marks on their psyches. They describe the jungle as a place that changed them, that taught them to think and move and perceive in ways that normal human life did not require. They speak of the hunting with a mixture of professional pride and retrospective unease, acknowledging that what they did was necessary while questioning whether they had become something other than the men they had been before. The Aboriginal instructors who helped shape their methods feature prominently in these recollections. Operators describe learning to see the world differently, to notice details that had previously escaped their attention entirely. They speak of tracking skills that seemed almost supernatural to observers, but were simply the application of ancient knowledge to modern warfare. These testimonies provide glimpses into a world that official histories have largely ignored. They reveal the human cost of becoming a phantom, the psychological price of transforming oneself into a predator of the most dangerous prey. They remind us that behind the statistics and the tactical analyses were young men who carried their country's expectations into the most hostile environment on Earth, and emerged changed in ways that peace could never fully undo. And yet the full truth of their methods may never be known. The comparison between Australian SAS and American Special Forces during Vietnam ultimately reveals more about institutional cultures than about individual capabilities. American operators were not less brave, less skilled, or less dedicated than their Australian counterparts. They were products of a military system that valued different attributes and measured success by different standards. The Australian system produced operators who could disappear into hostile terrain for weeks, who could eliminate enemies with surgical precision while leaving no evidence of their presence, who could manipulate enemy psychology through methods that bordered on the ritualistic. These capabilities emerged from a training philosophy that emphasized adaptation over standardization, patience over aggression, and psychological effect over body counts. The American system produced operators who could call in devastating firepower, who could insert and extract from hostile zones with helicopter mobility that no other nation could match, who could conduct direct action operations of unprecedented scale and complexity. Neither approach was inherently superior. Each produced results that the other could not match. But in the specific conditions of Vietnam, fighting a guerrilla enemy across terrain that negated many technological advantages, the Australian methods proved remarkably more effective per capita than anything the American military deployed. This was the lesson that Pentagon analysts documented, but that institutional resistance prevented from being learned. This was the source of the rivalry that simmered beneath official Allied cooperation. This was why the $5,000 bounty singled out Australian SAS operators rather than the far more numerous American Special Forces who also operated throughout South Vietnam. And when Australia finally withdrew, the jungle reclaimed its secrets. The final years of Australian involvement in Vietnam saw the SAS continue their operations even as political support for the war collapsed in Canberra. By 1971, with Australian combat forces preparing for withdrawal, the Phantoms were still patrolling, still hunting, still maintaining the terror that had made Phuoc Tuy province the most effectively pacified region in South Vietnam. The withdrawal itself reflected Australian operational philosophy. Rather than dramatic helicopter extractions or defended convoys, the SAS simply faded away as quietly as they had operated. One day they were there. The next day they were gone. The jungle absorbed their absence as it had absorbed their presence, and the enemy crept back into territory that had been denied to them for years. What remained after their departure was a province that had experienced something unprecedented in the Vietnam conflict. For nearly a decade, one of the most heavily infiltrated regions of South Vietnam had been pacified not through massive deployments or devastating firepower, but through the patient, precise, terrifying work of a few hundred men who had learned to become ghosts. The Viet Cong, who returned to Phuoc Tuy province after the Australian withdrawal, found a population that had been changed by years of relative security. They found infrastructure that had developed during the peaceful interlude. They found memories of the phantoms that would persist for generations, stories of the Ma Rung that parents told children as warnings about what happened to those who drew the attention of jungle spirits. But the echoes of the phantoms would reach far beyond Vietnam. The story of the Australian SAS in Vietnam challenges comfortable narratives about the conflict. It suggests that the war might have proceeded differently if American forces had been willing to learn from their smaller ally. It raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between military effectiveness and ethical constraints. It reveals a hidden history of rivalry and resentment beneath the surface of Allied cooperation. Most importantly, it demonstrates that the most dangerous warriors are not always those with the most impressive weapons or the largest forces. Sometimes they are the quiet ones, the patient ones, the ones who have learned to become invisible and to hunt humans with the same methods their ancestors used to hunt prey across the Australian outback for 40,000 years. The $5,000 bounty on Australian SAS heads was never collected because the phantoms never allowed themselves to become targets. They remained hunters rather than hunted, predators rather than prey, throughout their decade of operations in Vietnam. They wrote a chapter of special operations history that remains partially classified, partially controversial, and entirely remarkable. The jungle kept their secrets. The official histories overlooked their achievements. The institutional rivalries prevented their lessons from being learned. But among those who knew, who had served with them or against them, or had studied their methods in the quiet of classified briefings, the reputation of the Australian SAS in Vietnam remained undimmed. They were the only unit Ho Chi Minh truly feared, and the $5,000 bounty he placed on their heads was perhaps the most eloquent testament to their effectiveness that any special operations force has ever received. The phantoms of the jungle earned that tribute in blood and terror, and the echo of their operations reverberates through Special Forces doctrine to this day. A reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those you never see until it is far too late.